Today, the Spokane Police Department announced it has identified the man who killed 9-year-old Candy Rogers in 1959.
It was possibly the most well-known cold case in the city and the entire state. KREM 2's Ian Smay joining us now. He was at that press conference this morning, and he now is going to break down the circumstances of Candy's murder and how police were finally able to identify her killer.
Yeah, Candy Rogers was a 9-year-old girl who attended Holmes Elementary. She went missing one March evening while selling campfire grill mints in that West Central Spokane neighborhood. She was eventually found dead 16 days later, and it would be another 62 years before her family and the Spokane community would find closure in finding who was responsible for her death. Police identified her killer today as John Ray Hoff, who was 20 years old at the time of the crime. Today, police explained how they were finally able to solve the case, but we should warn you, the following report contains details of murder and sexual assault that may be disturbing to some viewers. Candy Rogers was described as small for her 4th grade class at Holmes Elementary School, standing at about 4 feet 4 inches tall. The 9-year-old had aspirations of becoming a full-fledged campfire girl. On March 6, 1959, she went out to sell campfire grill mints near her home on West Mission Avenue, but she never returned home, causing a massive search effort the likes of which Spokane had never seen before.
What is remarkable, volunteer efforts sometimes are short-lived, but the dedication here is it's really staggering. On the final weekend, 1,200 people came to the command post to help with the search.
Many groups helped out with the search, including a helicopter from Fairchild Air Force Base. When conducting a search over the Spokane River, it hit high-tension power lines and crashed into the water, killing 3 of the 5 men on board. Through the search efforts, boxes of campfire grill mints, the same ones Candy had been selling, were found. Eventually, a pair of hunters came across Candy's shoes in an area 7 miles from her home. The next day, 16 days after Candy went missing, the search was over. Her body was found behind pine needles and brush.
And there's no way around saying this is a violent crime against a small child that is hard to hear.
She had been sexually assaulted and strangled by a strip of cloth taken from her own clothes. Now, the search for Candy's body turned into a search for her killer. The case was originally led by the Spokane County Sheriff's Office, as Candy's body was found in unincorporated Spokane County. The same community that had came out in droves to find Candy was now trying to help find her killer.
Tips come in droves, hundreds of tips. Eventually these files will become public and everyone will be able to see these, and I think most people would be impressed by the number of calls and reports that came in. And over the years they worked through these.
The investigation would go on for decades. At one point, police thought they had a prime suspect. Hugh Morse was a man who pleaded guilty to 2 other murders in Spokane and another one in Minnesota. He was the strongest suspect for a number of reasons, but eventually, DNA tests showed his DNA didn't match the samples taken from the scene. He also passed a polygraph test. For decades, the case went unsolved. As such, it left an impact on the Spokane community.
It really changed the way Spokane worked back then, and how children were allowed to roam free or not.
Detective Stormont never gave up on the case after starting his work on it in 2011. He continued working on it, looking into tips throughout the years. Then, earlier this year, he finally found a forensics lab that would try to test DNA from Candy's underwear. The test landed police 3 suspects on Labor Day weekend, a trio of brothers from Spokane. One of those brothers was John Ray Hoff. He was 20 years old at the time of the crime and died in 1970 by suicide. Stormont ended up contacting one of his living daughters, who agreed to a DNA test. That showed that it was 2.9 million times more likely that the DNA belonged to someone who would be her dad. But Stormont wanted to be sure.
This is my personal opinion, and ultimately I'm wrong. But I have a concern that there is a brother out there that genealogy did not see, or that there is a paternity issue with Kathy. So, the most certain way to eliminate that concern is a 1-to-1 comparison with the actual suspect.
Police got a search warrant to exhume Hoff's body this September. They did a DNA test of his body against the DNA from the scene. It showed that it was 25 quintillion times more likely that the DNA belonged to Hoff than someone else. It was the final end to a case 62 years in the making and brought closure to the family and the Spokane community. But for law enforcement, it brought up conflicting emotions.
I would like to thank the Spokane community. I would like to simultaneously apologize that it took us this long to bring this case to completion.
This is a bittersweet moment for all of us, and definitely more bitter than sweet. You had the kidnapping of an innocent 9-year-old who was brutally and violently assaulted and murdered. A 9-year-old who had absolutely no concept of evil that exists.
Police say that the families of both Hoff and Rogers requested that the media don't reach out to them at this time, and we are honoring that request. Stormont said that he has met with many members of Candy's family in the days before Hoff's identity was announced, and he apologized to any family members he couldn't meet with.
Wow, what a case here.
incredible.
My goodness. Okay, stick around because we're going to check in with you in our next half hour of news. In the meantime, though, the closure of this investigation also means at least some measure of closure for Candy's family, who spent the last several decades wondering who killed the little girl.
Tonight, KREM 2's Cody Proctor has more on their reaction to this bittersweet news. Cody?
Whitney, Mark, the news is indeed bittersweet, both for the remaining members of Candy's family and for Hoff's. In fact, it was actually Hoff's daughter, Kathy, who submitted a DNA sample to be analyzed that helped the investigation.
I feel like Candy's loss was just a horrible loss. She was so cute, and she didn't have much time.
Candy Rogers was only 9 years old when she was reportedly murdered at the hands of John Ray Hoff. The act and her death left a hole in Candy's family tree.
She was an only child, her mom was an only child, and so that's really sad that they passed away with not knowing who had taken their granddaughter and daughter's life.
The rippling impact on the Rogers family is one that Hoff's daughter, Kathy, is all too aware of.
Very, very sorry for what my dad did, that he took her life horribly, and that he took her mom's life, really, took her dad's life. He took more lives than one.
Hoff died by suicide in 1970, and Kathy says she lived most of her life thinking it was due to depression.
And now I think, no, he was evil. He was evil, and it was an escape.
Now with the revelations from Spokane police, Kathy hopes Candy's family can find peace.
Even though it's not really justice, because he doesn't get any punishment, but that his name has this on it now, and they can know it's solved, and everybody can know it's done.
I hope everybody's at peace now. I know that we are.
And Spokane police officials say Hoff died when Kathy was 9 years old, the same age as Candy when she was murdered. Kathy volunteered her DNA to SPD to help the investigation this past Labor Day weekend after learning that her father was a suspect in Rogers' murder. In the newsroom, Cody Proctor, KREM 2 News.
Cody, thank you very much. What a story. The case certainly has gripped the Spokane community for, again, more than a half a century. And we understand that you may have some questions, perhaps a lot of questions. So coming up on KREM 2 News at 6:30, we're answering some of your questions about this case. So text those questions our way to 509-448-2000, and we'll do our best to get the answers.
And you can also text the word cold to read more about how Spokane police were able to crack this case, or you can also watch the full press conference from SPD today.